Greetings, everyone. I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Bragg for inviting me to speak before you today, and a number of people here that have been very helpful in terms of the mission that we've been on in Americus in Sumter County, trying to preserve the history of the civil rights movement in this county. People like Susan Bragg, Evan Kutzlow, an excellent writer and researcher who has been indispensable in terms of the information that we've been able to gather from him. Keaton Wynn, who just sponsored this tremendous exhibition. And I just was lucky enough to get into on some of the discussion among the students. I'm very inspirational and very glad I got a chance to hear some of that. I want to say, first of all, we just dodged a bullet in this country in terms of what just happened in the most recent election. And I think that we did that because enough forces came together, black and brown people of color, but also Gen Z and millennials. We all came together because I think everybody recognized just how close we were to losing just about everything. And it's not over yet. We have to continue to be vigilant because we know that those forces will still be coming after people who in this country who have been traditionally marginalized, ostracized, and kept in positions of low positions of power in this country. And that's what it's going to take, a coalition of people to coming together to challenge the things that have been happening. We went through an insurrection. We have election deniers and people who seem bent on taking this country backwards. So it's very important that we begin to have these discussions among ourselves, among our friends and neighbors and what have you. Keep the discussion going because it's not over yet. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Americus movement. We're talking about over 50 years ago. I was a young student. I was born in 1945 right here in Sumter County, delivered by a midwife at the house we lived in over in Brooklyn Heights. And grew up in a system, totally segregated schools. It was apartheid, Southern apartheid. I want to start by just sort of giving you a sense of what that was like during that time. Just a brief and what Americus was like. Until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, segregation by race was a law throughout Americus and throughout this land. By law, we could not go to restaurants, churches. We could not go to the same churches, stay in hotels, swim in public beaches or pools if they were attended by white people. It was indeed a place where blacks were relegated to second-class citizenship, and we were confined to spaces that were relegated to us by people who were in authority. Most southern towns, like Americus, were run by whites who had sole authority, sole power, and many of them were ruled by white power structures that would sometimes would be called White Citizens Council, who were for the most part set the rules and regulations for everybody in the county, and that those rules relegated black people to second-class citizenship. In America's white family patriarchy ruled with an iron fist and nepotism reigned throughout the city and county government. Fred Chappell was a county sheriff who was often referred to as the meanest man in the world, even by Dr. Martin Luther King. When I talk of a hierarchy, we talk about how the Chappell family ruled this county. He had a brother who was the county commissioner. He had an uncle who was a state patrolman, an aunt who was the county clerk in charge of voter registration, and another aunt who was a county commissioner. So every aspect of black life in Sumter County was ruled by whites in positions of power. And so to be black and living in America during that time meant that every point of your existence was ruled by whites in this town. We often look at these periods in history as singular incidents, but we don't seem to connect them to the historical aspect of racism in this country. We often have to look at what happened after Reconstruction in this country, where the period of lynching occurred. We talked about that this morning. And we talked about how we tend to gloss over these incidents of historical violence, and we tend not to talk about them. And so we find ourselves in this position every time we begin to, because we don't talk about them, because we don't discuss them, we tend to fall into the same sense of not remembering, and so we happen to wind up in the same place over and over again. A lot of it has to do with the system of education in this country, where we tend not to want to pass on this information. There's a discussion going on now in this country of parents trying to keep their kids from learning the true history of this country in terms of race relations. We have instances of parents going into classrooms, taking over school boards, banning books, and even threatening teachers who dare to teach the true history of this country. I can recall growing up and not really knowing, in terms of not having the experience of having people who looked like me, who had who were even discussed in history books, and we had no examples of people who looked like me that we could take those examples and teach our children and pass on those experiences. When the movement, what happened in Americus, Georgia during that time, we're talking about the early 60s, there was a perception among whites who run the city at that time that people who lived here, like myself and my parents, were completely satisfied, were with the status quo. And so what happened was that when the civil rights movement began around the country, there were people who came into Southwest Georgia, mainly students like yourselves, who had taken away time from their college studies and came south to help in things like voter registration and testing the laws of public accommodation. These students came south and were immediately deemed as outside agitators, and some were even labeled communists. As a kid growing up in Americus during that time, we had watched our parents and their reactions to how they responded to racism threats of violence and what have you, and we internalize that as kids. And I think that what happened was that when whites saw that, it was as if they felt that things were okay, that that was something that was acceptable for us. But when in fact, people felt that they were powerless to do anything about it. So that's not to say that they were not rebelling against what was happening to them, because they were in a sense passing on to us in subtle ways that how we could fight that oppression that was coming down on us. And so we began to mobilize the communities. We felt that power lay in the hands of those who were able to select the leaders and elect the leaders that could lead them. Voter registration to us was what we felt was the vehicle to give people power. Along with that came the violence and intimidation by local police authorities who jailed people, beat them. There were people who were sent to stockades like the Leesburg Stockade, young juvenile girls who were sent and jailed for up to 3 months, 2 and 3 months, with no toilet facilities, no shower facilities and what have you, fed 4 hamburgers a day, and kept in those conditions without their parents knowing where they were for at least a week or 2 weeks at a time. This occurred during a time when all over the South, people were rising up and trying to fight for their rights across the country. So when local officials saw what was happening in terms of people taken to the streets and to finally begin to march and for their rights, those forces that I talked about, like the White Citizens Council, went through lengths to further dehumanize and terrorize the local black population. And they did it through subtle means and some not so subtle means. With control of the news media, the newspapers, I'd like to read for you an article that was posted by one member of the White Citizens Council to give you a sense of what it was like at that time and how they felt that what was happening at the time was instigated by outside agitators. In other words, people had to come into the town. They didn't think that the people who lived here were dissatisfied enough so much that they would actually take to the streets and fight for their own rights. They thought that because of outside agitators, they would come here. That's why people were. And so this is the letter that appeared in the Americus Times Recorder. And it starts out simply by saying, to the frightened colored people of Americus, Georgia, my dear frightened friends, I want to write and say to you that you are not alone in these troublesome days. There are a vast host of white persons who are interested in your welfare, safety, and security. Like the Hebrew children of old, Americus is walking through the fiery furnace, but by the grace of God, we shall come out safely on the other side. These outsiders who have invaded our city are not your friends. They have only one interest, and that is the furthering of their selfish ambitions and the money they can make and collect. These people are paid so much a day to come in and cause trouble. They take advantage of such situations as this to solicit funds from all across the United States. When all this is over with, they will be hundreds of thousands of dollars richer. They are forcing the colored people of America to pay token to them, which they in turn put in their own pockets. They are guilty of taking little children and marching them through the streets for their own selfish ambitions. That's how the white power structure looked upon the citizens of America who had finally decided that they wanted to fight for their rights. They wanted better schools. They wanted better education. They wanted to be able to walk in stores and not be ostracized and not be treated with dignity and respect. They wanted the right to vote. They wanted all the things that they saw whites were having in this town. And it was anyone who went through that situation would naturally want for your kids and your grandkids. And so the movement was already there before people came into the city. We found that same sense of activism among our teachers who did the best they could with what they had. They instilled in us a sense of pride that they knew that we needed to have in order to survive that oppression that we face. We found that in some of the pastors, the black pastors in their churches, who initially were afraid to let people use their churches to meet and organize, but eventually found the strength and resolve to become leaders in the community as well. We found it in some of the fraternal organizations, black fraternal organizations, some of the people like the Masonic Lodge, the Freemasons, Elks Club members, American Legion members, who had no history of just outright rebellion, but who had, in a way, had already been behind the people in the city and in subtle ways provided that support that was needed to sustain a movement, a civil rights movement. So what I'm saying is that activism was always there. It just took student power to actually activate that and get the community behind us. The Americus movement happened at a time when Selma, Montgomery, Selma, Alabama, was demonstrations were occurring there daily for passage to obtain passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Americus was at the same time ran on a sort of a parallel track, but Americus, the struggle here sort of was undermined because it didn't get the publicity that Selma got. But what happened in Americus was that over summer of 63 through 65, hundreds of people were jailed. And as a result of that, two major decisions came out of Southwest Georgia, Americus, Georgia. One had to do with 4 civil rights workers who were charged with insurrection, which at the time in Georgia was punishable by death. What happened was that during one demonstration one night, 4 civil rights workers were targeted and jailed and charged with that insurrection charge. And the idea was to punish them and for them to be an example for anybody else, any other civil rights workers, that this could happen to them. That trial went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and after being in jail for about 90 days, they were released by the courts. That release had long-standing significant consequences because it meant that authorities could no longer jail civil rights workers and keep them jailed indefinitely without bail and what have you. Another case was the case of 4 women, black women, who decided one day to try and vote in a segregated line at the courthouse. They were arrested and put in jail because they tried to vote in the white women only line, and they stayed in jail until they were released. And the significance of that trial was that it struck down the laws of segregated voting lines throughout the state of Georgia. So those were things that significant gains that came about through the Americus movement. We had I want to talk a bit about what's happened in terms of what came out of that Americus movement. Several years ago, we began to collect documentation of the Americas movement because we felt it was important to pass on the legacy of that to the next generation. Had a chance to listen to a lecture last night by Brian Stevenson, who you may recall is head of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He is also a writer who wrote the book Just Mercy, and a film was recently produced by that, on that movie, a film starring Michael B. Jordan. Brian is a lawyer who took on the fight of representing incarcerated black and brown Americans in the penal system. We know about the effects of what mass incarceration has done to black and brown people in this country. It has something that's been occurring for decades now, and it's a kind of a holdover from Reconstruction. We went through periods of black people in this country being arrested and placed in positions and being held in prisons and institutions around this country. We talked about how, for instance, we tend to look at overall in this country. We've had a struggle with the the point of Brian's discussion was that we're at a point in this country that we keep coming back to the same place because we, as a country, failed to talk about what got us to this place. We don't talk about race and the conditions that keep people in the conditions that they're in. We tend to gloss over it, and we find ourselves coming back to this over and over again in terms of instead of trying to solve these problems, we tend to wind up in the same place. We look at what is happening in the schools now in terms of students being and teachers being threatened for teaching students about the history of racism in this country, the history of slavery, and it's a fight that people like yourselves have to take up because it's unconscionable to think that you're going to be kept from learning the facts about the history of this country. I recall that during my entire school in terms of going through from grade school to high school in this country, where we learned nothing about the history of black people in American in this country. We talked about how the founding of this country, democracy, what it meant, what it's supposed to have meant, and we didn't see ourselves as African Americans. We didn't see ourselves in those stories. And so this is where we are in this country right now. We don't have that sense of, we're slowly trying to get that sense of self, and so that we can finally begin to understand what the history of this country is. It's important that we take it and embrace it and talk about those things that we need to do to change this country. I'm encouraged by what I've seen with the young people in this country now that because it's going to take coalitions of all of us to tackle this the history of racism head on. And it's important to have discussions in forums like these to do that. The reason we began to collect and document the history of the Americas movement is because we felt it was important that we carry these lessons on and do the things that we felt that the country was not doing in terms of the institutions to educate our kids about the struggles that went on before them and to let them know that the shoulders that they stand on, where they came from and what they need to do to make it better for everybody in this country. We came back to Americus, those of us who had moved away and came back to Americus, and decided that we would form an organization to collect the documentation of the Americas movement that would include oral history, interviewing some of those people who were involved in those struggles, interviewing some of the people who had come before us, and we thought that we would house this in what would be called the Americus Sumter County Civil Rights Museum and Cultural Center. We found a building which was called the Americus Colored Hospital in its operation. Between 1923 and 1953, it was the only hospital in southwest Georgia that cared for black patients. It actually trained black doctors, it trained midwives and nurses and what have you. That building closed in 1953. It then was taken over by a group of women called the Americus City Federation of Colored Women's Club. It was a subsidiary of the National Colored Women's Club, founded in Philadelphia in 1895. And one of the founding members was Phyllis Wheatley. So the women took over that building during the 1950s and made it a community center for America's black youth, who had no outlets in terms of where they couldn't use the local swimming pool, which was segregated. We just couldn't go there. There were no facilities for black youth to attend to in the city. So this became, the Colored Hospital became an outlet for a community center for black youth, taken over by these women. During the 60s, in the Civil Rights Movement, we were able to set up a freedom school inside the one wing of that building. And at this freedom school, people volunteered to become teachers. We actually set up facilities to teach people how to, who were illiterate, who couldn't read or write, how to read and write. We taught them how to prepare to pass what was called the literacy test that people had to take in order to be able to register to vote. It was a place where we organized demonstrations as well. We set agendas about where we would go, what students would go out and canvass streets, house to house, door to door. We didn't have cell phones at that time, so it was literally a mass group of people going out in the community on foot, knocking on doors, trying to get people to register to vote. We knew that being able to vote was a power that we had. It was the only power we had. In most of these counties where we work, blacks comprise over 52% of the population. So the power was there in order to, but they just didn't have the registered numbers to vote to be able to enact change. But we knew that once we were able to elect our own leaders, change was going to come. And so what we began to do when we organized to begin to collect this information, we knew we needed to have a place to house this information once we collected it. And so we went back to the City Federation of Colored Women's Club a few years ago, and they allowed us to they agreed for us to sign an agreement to take over the building and to transform it into a Civil Rights Museum and Cultural Center. It is now, we're about to begin the phase of restoration. It is on the Georgia Historical list. We have already applied for the National Registry registration, and we've secured about 3 grants to begin that restoration of that building. We anticipate that it would house artifacts, documents that people can actually study the civil rights movement. It will also house histories of black family history in Americus that's been overlooked, that we don't hear about. It will also be a living facility where we will do forums like you have here. We will bring in all kinds of speakers to enlighten our communities about what is happening globally, nationally and globally around the world in terms of civil and human rights. It will house art classes. It would house, there would be an amphitheater for discussions as well, teaching and learning and what have you. But it'll be a chance and opportunity to continue the legacy of the civil rights movement and to continue having discussions that will keep people engaged in terms of trying to make this place, this country better for all Americans and not for just one segment of Americans. When I say that we literally dodged a bullet in this past election, I mean that literally because we're at a point in this country where we've got to look at what has been happening collectively in terms of what's been going on. The biggest issue in this country right now is the rise of white supremacy in this country. And it's something that we all have to face and recognize and reckon with at this point in time. It has never gone away. It was one of the basic tenets of the founding of this country, and we have to acknowledge that. But there are forces in the country that have always fought against it. During the civil rights movement, there were 2 significant areas of engagement that significantly changed the course of history in this country. In 1964, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee instituted a program that was basically held throughout Mississippi, the state of Mississippi. It was called Mississippi Freedom Summer, where SNCC was able to get students from all over the country to come to Mississippi, and it was mostly white students who came south to Mississippi to help black students engage in voter registration and to elect people in positions of power in Mississippi. That was successful. A year later, in 1965, SCLC instituted a program called SCOPE, which was also about bringing in students from all over the country to the South to register voters. And within a 6-month period, the SCLC program SCOPE registered over 50,000 people throughout 8 or 9 southern states in this country. And so we saw the power then of people coming together, black and white, to sort of level the playing field in terms of race relations in this country. That is what it's going to take today. We're not far removed from that period in this country. We are going to have to once again muster up the strength and the fortitude for us all to come together, because it's at a tipping point now that the country needs people like yourselves in this country to once again come together and to fight the forces that want to keep this country divided and separated. Uh, Otherwise, it will not survive. And so it's important that we continue having discussions like you've been having here on this campus and across the country. I'd like to um, sort of engage the audience here today in terms of questions you might have that you think we need to talk about in terms of furthering this discussion and how we might move forward. Yes, ma'am.
A thing I've had a problem with, and I know that they bring kind of awareness to, I want to say in Florida, I might be wrong, is the fact that people get felonies are eliminated from voting. And I feel like with the system in place that we've had for a while, and the, I can't remember what it's called, but like the school to prison
Mm-hmm.
thing that's happening, and I feel like it's extremely prevalent. I feel like it's unfair, especially since most of the felony doesn't even for your friend or whoever, some person that you knew had is illegal for marijuana. And I feel like that shouldn't eliminate somebody coming to illegal vote. And I feel like that takes away a lot of voice too, especially when a lot of crime really comes down to lacking the supplies that you need for life. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering how we can kind of, if that is a big issue, how we can address it.
We're talking about incarceration. Yeah. There's a whole history of how we've gotten to this point in this country in terms of mass incarceration. There are people in jail now who have been there for decades, black and brown people who have been there for decades for minor offenses and who a few weeks ago a person was released after serving 40 years in prison for selling 3 pounds of marijuana, where you have and now you have people in power who are making businesses out of it and who are selling, it's now legal, but yet and still you have these people who've been incarcerated, thousands of them, and they're still in jail. And so mass incarceration is one of the biggest issues in this country that we have to deal with. It's taken families, it's torn families apart. It has affected not only that family they're dealing with it, but their neighbors, their children, their children's children, what have you. But it's a pipeline, the prison system that people benefit from, the powers that be benefit from, and those marginalized communities, people of color, are the ones who pay the price for that. But it's one of the biggest issues that this country is facing at this point in time. And there are actually people that are in exile in other countries that had to flee this country because of things that they were involved in activities meant to uplift their communities, and for that they were targeted and charged with crimes that they shouldn't have been charged with, and they had to flee the country in order to survive. But the whole point is that this country has to be, particularly young people have to be able to come to the point where and decide that no longer that we want to live under this watch, and that we want to be part of the solution, and no longer will just sit idly by and watch someone who doesn't look like you bear the brunt of the injustices in this country. Okay. Susan? Um, if I'm hearing you correctly, what would propel them to do the things that they did at such a young age? Yeah, yeah. I think initially in a small town like Americus is and was when we were growing up, anything that was new that came into your environment was exciting and was something that you were attracted to. As 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, you're fearless, you know. You knew the repercussions of what could happen to you if you went into the streets and you decided to fight against the status quo. And of course, you had your parents too, who had those experiences of being humiliated, who had been possibly beaten or jailed. They knew that history. I often think about my grandfather who came here from Alabama. He had to flee Alabama in the middle of the night. He got into an argument with, he was working as a sharecropper on a farm. And he got into an argument with the white owner of the plantation over his wages. So in the middle of the night, because he was threatened, he had seen lynchings, he had seen people beat and shot for no reason at all. He left in the middle of the night. But he wound up in Sumter County at Earl Carter's farm, Jimmy Carter's farm. My grandfather's buried there now in Archery, Georgia, which was a black community just outside of Plains. And I didn't discover this until about 7 or 8 years ago, that they were there in this cemetery. I went there and I saw about 10 or 12 graves of my relatives who actually grew up there. My grandfather got work. Jimmy Carter's father allowed him to work on the farm until he was able to get his family back from Alabama to come over to Georgia. So we, as kids, we had heard about these experiences, you know. What I remember about my grandfather is the only thing I remember is that of a smokehouse when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I don't remember anything beyond that. But that's how I remember him, going to the smokehouse behind the big house where he was curing meats and things like that. But we heard these stories. So this was always still in the kids. There was a fear there, but there was, as a kid, you don't feel that nothing can hurt you, you know. And so that's what propelled kids out into the streets, I think. Once they got into the streets, and then came the knowledge of we were introduced to writers and authors who we had never heard of because it wasn't taught in the schools. We had no black history to speak of. In fact, we had no history at all. If you looked at the educational system, we could learn everything about the founding fathers. We learned later on that they were all slaveholders, you know, but there was nothing that black people could take to heart from those books. In fact, I talked to them earlier about how the books that we got in our classes from first grade all the way through 12th were books that were handed down. And we knew as students that they were at least 2 or 3 years older, that we were getting a second and third class education as black students. So we were behind from day one. So once you hit the streets and you saw the energy among the other kids in those demonstrations, you knew that that's where you had to be day after day after day. It didn't matter if they sent you to jail. There were people who were jailed. They were fire hosed. They were burnt with cattle prods that burned the flesh. They were beaten with baseball bats. In Americus, when the police department was overwhelmed by the numbers of people in the streets, they deputized local white citizens. If you were white, you could go to the police department and say, I want to be a deputy. If you didn't have a gun, they'd give you a gun. And these people would be unleashed into the streets to beat the heads of black young demonstrators. I have classmates now who have the same scar on the back of their head that they got from a beating with a baseball bat in 1960s. That scar is still on the back of their heads. Those flesh marks from the cattle prods, these are electric shocks that were used to herd cattle, were used on students, kids as young as 13 and 14 years, in here in Americus, Georgia. They still bear those scars on their bodies now. I have calluses on my hand for having worked. I was sentenced to 90 days to work in the city prison. I was 18 years old. And this was just trying to buy a ticket at the front window of the Martin Theater, downtown. We had to, as blacks, you had to go down an alley, go down to the entrance that was down an alley, up some stairs, in order to see a movie. You could not stand in the front of the theater and buy a ticket. And for that, we were sentenced to prison. And our punishment was digging ditches every day. We refused to work. We were placed in a hole. A 6x6 concrete bunker that they put us in, those of us who refused to work because we felt we hadn't done anything wrong. We were given 2 slices of bread a day and a cup of water in a little opening at the bottom of the door about this wide. And that was to punish us, to have an example set for other students who dared to get into the streets and to demonstrate as well. But those experiences fortified us. They made us even stronger. That's the story we want to tell. That's the story we need to tell. We have to tell because it happens over and over again because we fail to have these discussions among ourselves. It's unconscionable to me that you have parents, white parents today, who are going into the classrooms, taking over school boards, and who are demanding that their kids not read certain books, and making life-threatening, threatening people's lives because of that. It's insane to think that if your kids learn about the history of this country, the true history, that they're somehow going to be intimidated, they're going to be made to feel less of themselves and what have you. We have to reject that. We have to reject it very strongly. That's why I say that we're in a very bad place in this country right now because we've had all these issues confront us at one time. And what has unleashed this is what happens. It happened after Reconstruction when lynchings took place all across this country. It happened after World War II when blacks who had been drafted and gone to Europe and fighting the war, they came back home. They were targeted because they had been out of the country, and whites felt threatened because they had seen how people live in other countries. They came back here, and so in order to keep them in their place, they were targeted once again. Lynchings occurred all over this country to keep people in their place. It happened during the 60s. In the discussion this morning, one of the students very eloquently talked about the lynchings in this country, the history of lynchings in this country, which is something that Brian Stevenson, I mentioned earlier, talked about in his lecture last night. I encourage all of you to, at some point, visit the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, where the Lynching Museum is. At that facility, we found two monuments where the two lynchings that occurred in Sumter County, they have those monuments over there. And those monuments can be claimed by any county that has one of those monuments there can claim that monument and bring it back to that county. And we've already made preliminary registration to have one brought back here once we have our facility here in Americus. But remember that for every lynching that's documented, there are at least 10 others that were not documented in this country. And the history of lynching in this country is so profound. It's not only the act itself, but what it does to people who witness it or who hear about it, because it tends to, it weighs on their psyche that this is something that could happen to me or my someone I care about, my family member, what have you. But that was the purpose of lynching. It wasn't enough just to hang a person, but you had to shoot him, burn him alive, cut parts of his body off, as souvenirs, put them in jars and what have you, things like that. It was a ritual of torture and meant to inflict not only the body but the memory of a people. And that torture resonates even today all across this country. It's something that never goes away, has never gone away. We see it in how the interactions between blacks and the police. We talk about mass incarceration in this country. We talk about how, as I mentioned earlier, how a young Dylan Roof can murder 18 to 20 people in an AME church, and police can stop along the way, take him to the jailhouse and buy him a hamburger. And on the other hand, we see a knee on the neck of George Floyd, or we see Trayvon Martin being killed for having a toy gun in a park, someone having Skittles, or someone having an air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror in his car. Blacks being killed systematically all across this country for little or no reason. And the larger population turns a deaf ear and a blind eye to it. And what I'm saying is that this has to be everybody's fight, not just black and brown people's fight. It has to be everybody's fight. And that's why you will continue to see movements, institutions wage this fight, this battle, because it's never over. But you have to be in the fight. You've got to be in the fight in order for us to move forward. Thank you.